I'm 88 years old now. And if there's one thing I wish someone had told me when I was younger, it's this. The hardest truths in life are not the ones that hurt us the most. They're the ones that take us decades to accept. Before we begin, if you enjoy honest conversations about aging, life lessons, and the wisdom that only time can teach, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. Every week, we share stories and reflections that help make these later years a little less lonely and a lot more meaningful. Now, let me tell you something. When I was young, I believed life worked a certain way. I thought that if I worked hard, loved my family, did the right thing, and sacrificed for others, everything would eventually make sense. I believed happiness would arrive someday as a reward for being responsible. For years, I waited. I waited for the perfect moment to relax. I waited for people to appreciate my sacrifices. I waited for life to finally feel complete. But somewhere between raising children, losing loved ones, celebrating birthdays, and attending far too many funerals, I began to realize something uncomfortable. The life I was waiting for had already been happening, and the truth I spent decades avoiding was quietly standing in front of me the entire time. At 88, I no longer fear wrinkles, illness, or even death itself. What I fear is realizing too late that I spent too much of my life living according to other people's expectations instead of my own heart. Today, I want to share the hardest truth life ever taught me and why accepting it changed everything. For most of my life, I thought being a good person meant making other people happy. As a little girl, I wanted my parents to be proud of me. I followed the rules, worked hard, and tried not to disappoint anyone. Later, as a wife, I wanted my husband to feel supported. As a mother, I put my children's needs ahead of my own. And when I became a grandmother, I continued doing what I had always done, giving, helping, sacrificing. At the time, it felt noble, and perhaps it was. But there was a hidden cost that I didn't recognize until much later. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking myself what I wanted. When opportunities appeared, I often turned them down because someone else needed me. When I dreamed about traveling, learning something new, or simply taking time for myself, I told myself there would be time later. There was always another responsibility waiting, another person to please, another problem to solve. Years passed faster than I expected. The children grew up. My husband grew older. Friends came and went. And one day, I looked in the mirror and saw a woman in her 80s wondering where all those years had gone. The painful truth was that many of the people I had sacrificed for barely remembered those sacrifices, not because they were ungrateful, but because they were busy living their own lives. And that's when I learned something difficult. People appreciate your kindness, but they cannot build your happiness for you. No amount of approval from others can replace the joy of living a life that feels true to yourself. If I could sit beside my younger self today, I would gently take her hand and say, "Be kind, love deeply, help others whenever you can, but don't disappear in the process." Because the person you spend your entire life with is you. And if you neglect that relationship, no one else can repair it for you. One of the hardest truths I ever had to accept is that people are not thinking about me nearly as much as I imagined. That realization might sound disappointing at first, but it was actually one of the most liberating lessons of my life. For decades, I worried about what other people thought. I worried about saying the wrong thing. I worried about making mistakes. I worried about being judged. If I wanted to try something new, a little voice in my head would ask, "What will people think?" If I wore something different, spoke my mind, or made an unexpected decision, I would imagine everyone talking about it for weeks. But you know what I discovered? Most people were too busy worrying about themselves. At 88, I can look back and laugh at how much time I wasted carrying fears that never came true. I remember a woman named Carol. She was 72 when she told me she had always wanted to learn how to paint. Every time she saw an art class advertised at the community center, she considered signing up. Then she would talk herself out of it. I'm too old. I'll be terrible. Everyone will laugh at me. For nearly 5 years, she kept making excuses. Finally, one day, she gathered enough courage to attend. Do you know what happened? Nobody laughed. Nobody criticized her. Nobody even paid much attention. The other students were focused on their own paintings, their own mistakes, and their own insecurities. When Carol told me that story, she shook her head and said, I lost 5 years because of people who weren't even watching. How many of us do the same thing? How many dreams have we delayed because we were afraid of judgment? How many opportunities have we missed because we imagined criticism that never arrived? The older I get, the more I understand that life becomes lighter when you stop performing for an audience that doesn't exist. The truth is that most people are occupied with their own struggles, worries, families, and responsibilities. They are not keeping score of your mistakes. They are not analyzing your choices. And if some people do judge you, so what? No matter what you do, someone will approve and someone will disapprove. That has always been true, and it always will be. So don't wait for permission to live the life you want. One day, you will reach an age like mine and realize that the opinions you feared so much were never worth sacrificing your happiness for in the first place. Another truth that took me far too long to accept is that not everyone who stays in your life is truly walking beside you. When we're younger, we often believe that the longer we've known someone, the more valuable the relationship must be. We hold on to friendships, family connections, and social circles simply because they've existed for years. I used to think that way too. I believed loyalty meant never letting go. But age has a way of revealing what time alone cannot. After my husband passed away, I learned more about people in 2 years than I had in the previous 20. Some friends who promised they would always be there slowly disappeared. At first they called every week, then once a month, then not at all. Meanwhile, people I barely expected to hear from showed up in remarkable ways. A neighbor brought soup when I was sick. A woman from church called every Sunday just to check on me. A former coworker drove across town simply to share a cup of coffee and conversation. That's when I realized something important. A relationship should not be measured by its age. It should be measured by its presence. There is a difference between people who are part of your history and people who are part of your life. Some individuals remain in our contact lists long after they have stopped caring about our well-being. We keep reaching out because of shared memories, not because of genuine connection. And sometimes we exhaust ourselves trying to maintain relationships that ended emotionally years ago. At 88, I no longer chase people. I no longer beg for attention, affection, or effort. The people who truly care don't make you wonder where you stand. They don't appear only when it's convenient. They don't make you feel like a burden. The hardest part is accepting that some relationships are meant to end, even when there was once love, friendship, or loyalty. But there is freedom in that acceptance. When you stop holding on to the wrong people, you create space for the right ones. And in the later chapters of life, I have discovered that a few sincere relationships are worth far more than a crowd of familiar faces. Because when the difficult days come, and they always do, it isn't the number of people you know that matters. It's knowing who will still be there when the room grows quiet. For many years, I believed that my children were the center of my world. And to be honest, I don't regret loving them the way I did. I would have done anything for them. Like many parents, I worked long hours, worried through sleepless nights, and made countless sacrifices so they could have opportunities I never had. Their happiness felt like my purpose. Their successes felt like my victories. Their pain felt like my own. When they were young, that made sense. They needed me. But here's the truth that took me decades to accept. Children are supposed to grow away from us. That is not a failure of parenting. That is the goal of parenting. I remember a woman named Evelyn who spent nearly her entire life devoted to her family. After her husband died, her children became her whole world. She expected frequent visits, long phone calls, and family gatherings every weekend. But life had other plans. Her children had careers, spouses, grandchildren, responsibilities, and problems of their own. They loved her deeply, but they could not organize their lives around her needs. At first, Evelyn felt hurt. "They don't care about me anymore," she would say. But over time, she began to understand something important. Her children had not abandoned her. They were simply living the lives she had worked so hard to help them build. That realization changed everything. Instead of waiting by the phone, she joined a book club. She started volunteering twice a week. She made new friends and rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried beneath decades of responsibility. The happiest older adults I know love their children without expecting their children to become their entire source of happiness, because that's a burden no son or daughter can carry forever. At 88, I still treasure every phone call, every visit, every hug from my family, but I no longer expect them to fill every empty space in my life. Those spaces belong to me. And perhaps the most loving thing a parent can do, even in old age, is to let their children live freely while continuing to build a meaningful life of their own. After all, love grows stronger when it is given freely, not when it is held together by expectation. If there is one thing that becomes painfully clear when you reach your late 80s, it is this: time is far more valuable than money. I know that sounds like a cliche. People say it all the time. But when you're young, you don't really believe it. I certainly didn't. When I was in my 30s and 40s, I thought I was building a better future. I worked hard, saved money, paid bills, and postponed things I wanted to do. I'll do it next year. I'll travel when I retire. I'll spend more time with friends when life slows down. I'll call that person someday. The problem is that someday is one of the most dangerous words in the world, because someday quietly turns into years, and years quietly turn into decades. Before you know it, the opportunities you thought would always be waiting for you have disappeared. I still remember a friend named Richard. He spent most of his life working. He was disciplined, responsible, and admired by everyone around him. He often talked about taking his wife on a long trip across the country after retirement. It was their dream. They planned it for years. But when retirement finally arrived, so did her illness. Within 2 years, she was gone. One afternoon, Richard looked at me with tears in his eyes and said something I'll never forget. "We spent our whole lives preparing to live instead of actually living." That sentence stayed with me. Not because Richard was unusual, but because so many of us make the same mistake. We assume there will always be another summer, another birthday, another opportunity to say, "I love you," another chance to forgive someone, another chance to begin. But life makes no such promises. At 88, I don't measure wealth by the size of a bank account anymore. I measure it by moments. A conversation with someone I love, a peaceful morning with a cup of coffee, a phone call from an old friend, a sunset I took the time to notice. Those moments are the real treasures. Money can buy comfort. It can buy convenience. It can even buy extra time in certain situations. But it cannot buy back a year that has already passed. It cannot restore a missed opportunity, and it cannot replace the memories you never created. That's why the older I get, the less interested I am in accumulating things, and the more interested I am in experiencing life while I still can. Because one day, whether we are ready or not, time will ask for everything back. And when that day comes, the life we truly lived will matter far more than the money we managed to save. For most of my life, I believed happiness was waiting somewhere ahead of me. It always seemed connected to having a little more money, a little more security, a bigger house, a newer car, a better position. I kept telling myself that once I reached the next milestone, I would finally feel content. The strange thing is that every time I reached one goal, another appeared in its place. The finish line kept moving, and for years I chased it. Then, as I grew older, I began noticing something that didn't make sense. Some of the happiest people I knew had very little. One of them was a widow named Grace. She lived in a small apartment, drove an old car, and rarely spent money on anything unnecessary. By most standards, she wasn't wealthy. Yet every time I saw her, she seemed genuinely happy. She laughed easily. She enjoyed simple meals. She spent time with friends. She noticed flowers blooming in the spring and sunsets in the evening. Meanwhile, I knew people with beautiful homes, large retirement accounts, and every comfort imaginable who were constantly worried, dissatisfied, or lonely. That's when I started to understand something important. Happiness is not created by having more. It's created by appreciating what is already here. At 88, some of my happiest moments are surprisingly ordinary. Sitting on my porch in the morning sunlight, hearing the voice of someone I love, reading a good book on a quiet afternoon, watching birds gather outside my window. None of those things cost very much. Yet they bring me more peace than many of the possessions I once worked so hard to acquire. The hardest part is that we often learn this lesson too late. We spend decades collecting things when what we truly need are experiences, connections, purpose, and gratitude. Don't misunderstand me. Comfort matters. Financial security matters. But neither one guarantees joy. Real happiness begins when you stop asking, "What else do I need?" and start asking, "What have I already been blessed with?" At 88, I can tell you this with complete certainty. The richest people are not always the ones who have the most. They are the ones who have learned to enjoy what they already have. And now we arrive at the hardest truth of all. The truth that took me nearly 88 years to fully accept. No one can live your life for you. It sounds obvious when you hear it. Of course, no one can live your life. Of course, no one can make your choices. Of course, no one can walk your path. But I spent decades acting as if someone else held the key to my happiness. I waited for approval. I waited for appreciation. I waited for people to understand me. I waited for circumstances to improve. I waited for life to become easier. And while I was waiting, life kept moving. The years didn't stop. The clock didn't pause. The opportunities didn't remain where I left them. One day, after my husband passed away, I found myself sitting alone in a quiet room. The house felt larger than it ever had before. The silence was overwhelming. For months, I focused on everything I had lost. The companionship, the routines, the future I had imagined. I kept thinking that someone or something would eventually come along and make me feel whole again. But nothing changed. Not because life was cruel, because life was waiting for me to take responsibility for my own happiness. That realization was painful, yet it was also incredibly freeing. I began to understand that no friend could create purpose for me. No child could create peace for me. No amount of money could create meaning for me. Those were things I had to build myself. Slowly, I started saying yes to life again. I joined activities. I met new people. I pursued interests I had neglected for years. Most importantly, I stopped asking whether other people approved of my choices. I started asking a different question. Does this make my life richer, kinder, more meaningful? That question changed everything. The greatest freedom I have discovered in old age is not freedom from responsibility. It is freedom from the need to live according to someone else's expectations. At 88, I finally understand that happiness is not something other people give us. It is something we create through our choices, our attitudes, and the courage to live authentically. And if there is one lesson I hope you remember after hearing my story, it is this. Do not wait for permission to live your life. Do not wait for perfect circumstances. Do not wait for someone else to rescue you. Because the life you are waiting for is already happening, and no one, not your family, your friends, or society, can live it for you. Only you can.